The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a shroud as Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Harrison peered through his field glasses at the approaching Union gunboats. It was May 18th, 1863, and the fate of the Confederacy hung in the balance along the bluffs of Vicksburg. The city, perched high above the great river's bend, had earned its nickname as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. But now that fortress was about to face its greatest test. Harrison lowered his glasses and turned to his aide, Captain Thomas. "Whitmore, signal General Pemberton immediately. Grant's forces are positioning for a full siege. We're about to be cut off from all reinforcement." The Confederate defense of Vicksburg had been months in the making. General John Clifford Pemberton, a Pennsylvanian who had chosen to fight for the South, commanded approximately 30,000 Confederate troops within the city's defensive perimeter. These men represented the last major Confederate force between the Union and complete control of the Mississippi River, a waterway President Abraham Lincoln had declared must flow unvexed to the sea. As Harrison made his way through the trenches that morning, he could see the determination etched on the faces of his soldiers. Many were barely out of boyhood, their uniforms patched and worn from months of campaigning, yet they understood what was at stake. If Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, cutting off vital supplies from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. The Union commander, General Ulysses Simpson Grant, had already proven his tenacity in battles across Tennessee and Mississippi. His forces, numbering over 70,000 men, had successfully crossed the Mississippi River south of Vicksburg and were now approaching from the east. The one direction the Confederates had not expected. Grant's brilliant maneuver had caught Pemberton off guard, forcing the Confederate general to consolidate his forces within Vicksburg's defensive lines, rather than meet the enemy in open battle. According to contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly, the strategic importance of Vicksburg could not be overstated. Control of this river city would effectively seal the fate of the rebellion. The magazine noted that the Mississippi River is the backbone of America, and Vicksburg is the vertebra that holds the Confederacy together. Harrison paused at a forward observation post, where Sergeant Major William McKenzie was directing the placement of artillery. The grizzled veteran had served with distinction at Shiloh and Corinth, and his experience was invaluable to the younger soldiers under his command. "Sergeant Major, what's your assessment of our position?" Harrison inquired. McKenzie spat tobacco juice into the red Mississippi dirt before responding. "Well, sir, we've got the river at our backs and Grant's boys combing at us from three sides. But these bluffs give us a good field of fire, and our boys know what they're fighting for. We'll make him pay dearly for every yard." The defensive preparations had been extensive. Confederate engineers had constructed a series of redoubts, rifle pits, and artillery emplacements that stretched for miles around the city's perimeter. The natural terrain provided excellent defensive positions, with steep ravines and thick forests that would channel any Union assault into predetermined killing fields. As the sun climbed higher, Harrison could see the dust clouds on the horizon that marked the approach of Grant's army. The siege of Vicksburg was about to begin, and with it, one of the most desperate stands in Confederate military history. By May 19th, 1863, the Union forces had completely encircled Vicksburg, transforming the once proud river city into a besieged fortress. Captain Whitmore crouched beside a cannon emplacement on the 3rd Louisiana Redan, watching as blue uniformed soldiers established their siege lines barely 300 yards away. The methodical precision of their movements filled him with a growing sense of dread. General Pemberton had called an emergency council of war the previous evening, and the news was uniformly grim. Supplies were already running low, and with all roads into the city now controlled by Union forces, no relief could be expected. Major General Martin Luther Smith, Pemberton's chief engineer, had presented a stark assessment of their defensive capabilities. "Gentlemen," Smith had declared, his voice heavy with resignation, "we have sufficient ammunition for perhaps 3 weeks of intensive fighting. Our food stores will last perhaps 6 weeks if we implement strict rationing immediately." After that, he had left the sentence unfinished, but every officer in the room understood the implications. The civilian population of Vicksburg, numbering approximately 4,000 souls, found themselves trapped alongside the Confederate garrison. Many had already begun digging caves into the hillsides to escape the inevitable bombardment. Mrs. Emma Balfour, wife of a local physician, wrote in her diary that the sound of picks and shovels echoes through the night as our neighbors burrow into the earth like moles, seeking safety from the coming storm. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison made his daily rounds through the defensive positions. Noting how his men had adapted to their precarious situation, Private Joshua Murphy, a 19-year-old farm boy from Alabama, had become an expert marksman during the campaign. Harrison found him cleaning his rifle in a forward rifle pit, his eyes constantly scanning the Union lines. "Any movement out there, Murphy?" Harrison asked. "Yes, sir. They're digging parallels, just like we learned about at school, getting closer every day, but I've got their range marked, and when they come, I'll be ready." The Union's strategy was becoming clear. Rather than launch costly frontal assaults against the Confederate fortifications, Grant had decided to starve the defenders into submission. His engineers were constructing elaborate siege works, including approach trenches that zigzagged toward the Confederate lines and artillery positions that could rain destruction on the city below. Admiral David Porter's Union gunboat fleet controlled the river, their massive guns capable of hurling shells weighing over 100 pounds into the heart of Vicksburg. The naval bombardment had begun in earnest on May 22nd, and the reverberations could be felt throughout the city's underground passages. Sergeant Major Mackenzie had established his command post in what had once been the parlor of a prosperous merchant's home. The building's walls were 3 feet thick, providing some protection from the incoming shells, but the constant noise was taking its toll on the men's nerves. "The boys are holding up well," Mackenzie reported to Harrison during one of his visits. "But they're starting to ask questions about when General Johnston might arrive with reinforcements." General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in the region, had promised to organize a relief expedition, but his forces were scattered across Mississippi and Tennessee. Even if he could assemble an army large enough to challenge Grant, the Union general had positioned strong detachments to guard against such an attempt. Contemporary reports from the New York Tribune described the siege as a masterpiece of military engineering, with Grant's forces methodically tightening their grip on the rebel stronghold like a python, crushing its prey. The newspaper's correspondent noted that the Confederates fight with the desperation of men who know that defeat means not just military failure, but the possible end of their cause. As night fell on May 25th, Harrison stood on the parapet of the Great Redoubt, watching the muzzle flashes from Union artillery positions. Each flash was followed by the whistle of an incoming shell and the crash of its explosion. Somewhere in the city below, the siege had only just begun, but already the noose was tightening around the defenders' necks. The dawn of May 27th, 1863, brought with it a crescendo of artillery fire that seemed to shake the very foundations of Vicksburg. Captain Whitmore pressed himself against the earthen wall of his bunker as a Federal shell exploded, less than 50 yards away, showering him with dirt and debris. The Union bombardment had intensified over the past week, and it was clear that Grant was preparing for something more than a simple siege. In the Warren County Courthouse, which had been converted into a makeshift field hospital, Dr. William Balfour worked tirelessly to treat the mounting casualties. The physician had been forced to perform surgery by candlelight, as the constant shelling made it too dangerous to maintain proper lighting. His wife Emma had volunteered as a nurse. "Despite the obvious dangers, Doctor," she whispered during a brief lull in the bombardment, "we're running low on morphine and surgical supplies. The men are suffering terribly." Dr. Balfour wiped the sweat from his brow with a blood-stained cloth. "We'll make do with what we have, my dear. These brave men deserve nothing less than our best efforts." Regardless of the circumstances, the civilian population had adapted to their underground existence with remarkable resilience. Entire families lived in caves carved into the hillsides, emerging only when absolutely necessary. Children played games in the dim light of their subterranean homes, their laughter providing a surreal counterpoint to the thunder of artillery above. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had established his headquarters in a reinforced cellar beneath the city's main hotel. From this position, he could coordinate the defense of the Confederate lines while maintaining communication with General Pemberton's staff. The telegraph lines had been cut early in the siege, forcing the defenders to rely on courier service to maintain contact between different sections of the perimeter. On May 28th, Harrison received disturbing intelligence from his forward observers. Union engineers were constructing something unprecedented in the ravines below the 3rd Louisiana Redan. They were digging a mine shaft directly beneath the Confederate fortification. Sergeant Major Mackenzie, Harrison called out as he studied the reports, "Assemble a detail of our best miners. If the Yankees are planning to blow us to kingdom come, we need to dig a counter mine immediately." The practice of military mining dated back centuries, but it had been perfected during the current war. Engineers would tunnel beneath enemy fortifications and pack the excavation with gunpowder, creating massive explosions that could obliterate entire defensive positions. The race between mine and countermine often determined the outcome of prolonged sieges. Private Murphy, despite his youth, had worked in coal mines before the war and volunteered for the dangerous assignment. Working in shifts around the clock, the Confederate miners began their own tunnel, hoping to intercept the Union excavation before it could be completed. "It's like fighting a war underground," Murphy explained to his messmates. "You can hear them digging on the other side, but you never know when you might break through into their tunnel. Makes a man's nerves jumpy, I can tell you." The food situation had become critical by the end of May. Quartermaster general supplies were distributed with military precision, but even with strict rationing, it was clear that starvation would become a factor long before any relief force could arrive. Some soldiers had begun supplementing their meager rations by catching rats and other vermin, while others foraged for edible plants in the few areas not under direct Union observation. According to dispatches published in the Richmond Examiner, the siege of Vicksburg had captured the attention of the entire Confederacy, with newspapers describing the defenders as heroes standing firm against overwhelming odds, their courage shining like a beacon in the darkness of our struggle for independence. General Pemberton faced an impossible decision. Military logic suggested that the position was untenable. His forces were outnumbered more than 2-1, supplies were dwindling rapidly, and no relief was in sight. Yet the strategic importance of Vicksburg made surrender unthinkable. As long as the Confederate flag flew over the river city, the Union could not claim complete victory. In the Western Theater died as June began. The sound of underground excavation grew louder each night. Both sides raced to complete their tunnels, knowing that the first to succeed would hold a decisive advantage in the struggle for Vicksburg. June 6, 1863, marked the beginning of the most desperate phase of the siege. Deep beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, Private Murphy and his fellow miners worked in suffocating darkness, their ears straining to detect the sound of Union picks and shovels just yards away. The subterranean battle had become a deadly game of cat and mouse, with both sides racing to complete their tunnels first. "Listen," Murphy whispered to his partner, Corporal James Patterson, as they paused in their excavation. Through the earth came the unmistakable sound of metal striking stone. "They're close, maybe 10 feet to our left." The Confederate countermine had been advancing for over a week, following the estimated path of the Union excavation. Military engineers on both sides understood the deadly mathematics of siege war. Whoever completed their mine first would gain the ability to destroy the enemy's position with a single massive explosion above ground. The daily bombardment continued with mechanical precision. Union artillery had been reinforced with massive siege guns, capable of hurling shells weighing 300 pounds. These monsters could punch through the thickest earthworks, and their psychological effect on the defenders was almost as devastating as their physical impact. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison made his way through the communication trenches, visiting each defensive position to maintain morale and assess the condition of his troops. What he saw troubled him deeply. Many of his soldiers showed signs of severe malnutrition, their uniforms hanging loosely on gaunt frames. The daily ration had been reduced to a handful of cornmeal and a thin slice of bacon, barely enough to sustain men engaged in the exhausting work of maintaining defensive positions. Under constant fire at the stockade Redan, Harrison found Captain Whitmore supervising the repair of damaged earthworks. A Union shell had scored a direct hit the previous evening, creating a gap in the parapet that exposed the defenders to enemy fire. "How are the men holding up, Thomas?" Harrison asked quietly. Whitmore glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard before responding. "They're at their breaking point, sir. We've had 3 cases of men attempting to desert in the past week, and I fear there will be more. The constant shelling, the lack of food, the uncertainty about relief, it's wearing them down faster than enemy bullets." The civilian population faced even greater hardships. Mrs. Emma Balfour's diary entries from this period paint a vivid picture of life under siege. "We subsist on a diet of cornbread and boiled peas when we can obtain them. Many families have resorted to eating their horses and mules. The children cry constantly from hunger, and their mothers have little comfort to offer." On June 8th, the underground war reached its climax. Private Murphy's countermine team had successfully intercepted the Union tunnel, but what they discovered filled them with horror. The Federal excavation was packed with over 1,000 pounds of gunpowder, enough explosive force to obliterate the entire Confederate position and everyone defending it. "Sweet Jesus," Patterson whispered as they stared at the barrels of black powder stacked in the enemy tunnel. "They mean to blow us all to hell." Working frantically, the Confederate miners began removing the gunpowder barrels one by one, hauling them through their own tunnel to safety. It was dangerous work. A single spark could detonate the entire cache, killing everyone in both tunnels. But the alternative was certain death for the hundreds of soldiers defending the region above. News of the successful countermine operation spread quickly through the Confederate lines, providing a much-needed boost to morale. General Pemberton himself visited the tunnel entrance to congratulate the miners, understanding that their courage had prevented a disaster that could have broken the entire defensive line. However, intelligence reports soon revealed that the Union forces had begun excavating additional mines at different points along the Confederate perimeter. Grant's engineers were systematically working to undermine every major defensive position, forcing the Confederate command to stretch their limited mining resources across multiple locations. The Richmond Whig reported on June 10th that the heroic defenders of Vicksburg continued to hold their ground against overwhelming odds, their determination serving as an inspiration to all who value liberty and independence. Yet even as newspapers celebrated their courage, the reality facing the besieged garrison grew more desperate with each passing day. Sergeant Major Mackenzie had begun conducting informal surveys of his men's condition, and the results were alarming. Nearly 40% showed signs of scurvy and other diseases associated with malnutrition. Medical supplies were virtually exhausted, and Dr. Balfour was forced to perform surgery without proper anesthetics. As June progressed, the sound of digging could be heard at multiple points along the Confederate lines. The underground war had expanded beyond a single tunnel system to encompass a network of mines and countermines that stretched beneath much of the city's defensive perimeter. The fate of Vicksburg now depended as much on the courage of men working in darkness far below, ground as on the soldiers manning the ramparts above. By June 20th, 1863, the siege of Vicksburg had entered its most critical phase. The Confederate garrison, now reduced to fewer than 25,000 effective troops, faced starvation as their final rations dwindled to nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood in the pre-dawn darkness at the salient work, watching as his skeletal soldiers prepared for what might be their final day of resistance. The Union bombardment had become so intense that movement during daylight hours was virtually impossible. Shells fell every few minutes throughout the city, their explosions creating a hellish landscape of shattered buildings and crater-marked earth. The civilian population had retreated so far underground that entire neighborhoods appeared abandoned, though the sound of children crying could still be heard echoing from the cave systems carved into the hillsides. Private Murphy, now promoted to corporal for his heroic work in the tunnels, had become a shadow of his former self. The farm boy from Alabama, who had once boasted of his marksmanship, now struggled to hold his rifle steady, his hands trembling from hunger and exhaustion. Yet he remained at his post, understanding that the fate of the Confederacy itself might depend on holding Vicksburg for just a few more days. Corporal Harrison addressed him during his morning rounds. "Any word from the miners about additional Union excavations?" Murphy nodded weakly. "Yes, sir. They're digging under the Great Redoubt now, and probably under the 2nd Texas Lunette as well. We're trying to counter them, but we don't have enough men for all the work that needs doing." The situation in the field hospitals had become desperate beyond description. Dr. Balfour was performing amputations without morphine, using whiskey when available, and having patients bite on leather straps when it was not. His wife, Emma, had organized the surviving civilian women into nursing teams, but they could do little more than provide comfort to the dying. The wounded asked for water more than anything else. Emma wrote in her diary, "We have so little to give them. The wells are running dry, and what water we can obtain is often contaminated by the constant shelling. I fear disease will claim as many lives as enemy bullets." General Pemberton faced the most agonizing decision of his military career. Intelligence reports suggested that General Johnston was finally assembling a relief force in the Jackson area, but even optimistic estimates indicated it would be at least 2 weeks before any rescue attempt could be mounted. His garrison could not survive another 2 weeks without food or adequate medical supplies. On June 21st, Pemberton called together his senior officers for what everyone understood might be their final council of war. The meeting took place in a reinforced bunker beneath the courthouse. its walls scarred by shell fragments, and its air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. "Gentlemen," Pemberton began, his voice heavy with the weight of command, "we must face the reality of our situation. Our ammunition is nearly exhausted, our food supplies are gone, and our men are dying of starvation and disease. Yet the enemy shows no sign of relaxing their siege." Major General Smith presented the latest intelligence reports, which painted a picture of complete encirclement. Grant's forces had been reinforced to over 75,000 men, while Federal gunboats controlled every mile of the Mississippi River. Even if Johnston's relief force materialized, it would face overwhelming odds. Contemporary accounts from the New York Herald described the siege as nearing its inevitable conclusion, with correspondents noting that the rebel garrison fights with the desperation of condemned men, knowing that each day may be their last, yet unwilling to surrender the prize that has cost both sides so dearly. Captain Whitmore, now commanding what remained of 3 companies after casualties and disease had decimated the ranks, spoke for many of the junior officers. "Sir, the men will follow whatever decision you make. They've proven their courage beyond question, but they're looking to you for leadership in this darkest hour." The mining war continued below ground, with both sides working frantically to complete their excavations. Confederate counter-mining efforts had been successful in several cases, but Union engineers had adapted their tactics, creating multiple mine shafts that stretched the defenders' resources beyond their breaking point. Sergeant Major Mackenzie, whose gruff exterior had masked a deep concern for his men throughout the siege, reported that discipline was beginning to break down in some units. "The boys are holding together better than I expected," he told Harrison privately. "But hunger does things to a man's mind. We've had more attempted desertions, and I fear we may see worse before this is over." As June drew toward its close, everyone in Vicksburg understood that the end was approaching. The question was no longer whether the city would fall, but whether the garrison would surrender with honor or face complete annihilation. The next few days would determine not just the fate of Vicksburg, but potentially the outcome of the entire war. July 1st, 1863, dawned with an eerie silence that unnerved the Confederate defenders more than the constant bombardment they had endured for weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood at his observation post, scanning the Union lines through field glasses that shook in his malnourished hands. After 47 days of siege, something fundamental had changed in the enemy's behavior. "They've stopped firing," Captain Whitmore observed, his voice barely above a whisper. "In all these weeks, this is the first time the guns have been silent for more than a few minutes." The cessation of artillery fire was not a mercy, it was preparation. Harrison's military experience told him that Grant was planning something decisive, possibly a final assault that would end the siege through overwhelming force rather than starvation. The Union commander had grown impatient with the slow pace of the siege, particularly as news arrived of simultaneous battles being fought at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Throughout the Confederate lines, skeletal soldiers peered over their earthworks with mixture of curiosity and dread. Many had not eaten a proper meal in over a week, surviving on a daily ration of pea soup made from ground field peas. That barely provided enough nutrition to maintain consciousness. Some men had taken to chewing on leather from their equipment, while others had resorted to eating the bark from trees that had somehow survived the constant shelling. Private Murphy, now so gaunt that his uniform hung on him like a scarecrow's clothing, maintained his post at the forward rifle pit with grim determination. His ammunition was down to 12 rounds, the same number he had started with on his first day of military service. The irony was not lost on him. "If they come today," he confided to Corporal Patterson, "I'll make every shot count. After that, it's bayonet work." The civilian population had reached the point of absolute desperation. Emma Balfour's diary entry from July 1st recorded the depths of their suffering. "The children no longer cry from hunger. They lack the strength. We have eaten the last of the rats and even the leather from our shoes. Death would be a mercy for many, yet still we endure, hoping against hope for deliverance." General Pemberton had spent the sleepless night of June 30th reviewing his options, all of which led to the same inevitable conclusion. His effective fighting force had been reduced to fewer than 18,000 men, many of whom could barely stand. Medical supplies were completely exhausted, and the last of the ammunition was being reserved for a final defensive action. At dawn on July 2nd, a white flag appeared above the Union lines. The sudden appearance of the truce banner sent a ripple of confusion through both armies. After weeks of relentless warfare, The prospect of negotiation seemed almost impossible to comprehend. General Grant's aide-de-camp, carrying a message under flag of truce, approached the Confederate lines with an offer that Pemberton had been dreading. The Union commander proposed a meeting to discuss terms of surrender, acknowledging the gallant defense but emphasizing the hopelessness of continued resistance. Harrison accompanied Pemberton to the fateful meeting, which took place in a small house between the opposing lines. The Confederate general, still maintaining his dignity despite the desperate circumstances, listened as Grant outlined his terms. The Union commander, recognizing the exceptional courage displayed by the Confederate garrison, offered to parole the defenders rather than hold them as prisoners of war. "Your men have fought with honor," Grant acknowledged. "They deserve to return to their homes rather than languish in prison camps. However, the city must surrender unconditionally, and all military supplies must be turned over to federal forces." The mining operations continued even during the truce negotiations. Union engineers had completed their excavation beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan and were preparing to detonate over 3,000 pounds of gunpowder. The explosion, when it came, would create a crater large enough to drive a locomotive through, eliminating the last major obstacle to a successful assault. Reports from the Charleston Mercury described the negotiations as the final act in a drama of heroism that has inspired the entire Confederacy, with the defenders of Vicksburg writing their names in letters of gold across the pages of military history. Sergeant Major Mackenzie gathered his remaining men for what might be their final formation as a unit. These scarecrow soldiers, held together by duty and shared suffering, represented the last organized Confederate force on the Mississippi River. Their surrender would give the Union complete control of America's greatest waterway, splitting the Confederacy in half. As July 3rd dawned, the fate of Vicksburg hung in the balance of Pemberton's decision. The choice was simple but agonizing: surrender with honor or face annihilation in a final, hopeless battle. The telegraph lines to Richmond had been cut for weeks, leaving the Confederate general to make his decision without guidance from his superiors. The sound of picks and shovels continued to echo from beneath the earth, a reminder that even in the final hours of the siege, the deadly game of mine and countermine continued. The race between explosion and surrender would determine whether Vicksburg fell to negotiation or to the devastating power of buried gunpowder. July 4th, 1863, Independence Day, would forever be remembered as the day Vicksburg fell. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood beside General Pemberton as the Confederate commander prepared to sign the surrender documents that would end the longest siege in American military history. The irony of surrendering on the nation's birthday was not lost on any of the participants in this solemn ceremony. The formal surrender took place at the McLean House, a modest structure that had somehow survived 4 to 7 days of constant bombardment. Harrison watched as his commanding general affixed his signature to the document that would effectively split the Confederacy in two. The strategic importance of this moment could not be overstated. With Vicksburg in Union hands, Federal forces would control the entire Mississippi River from its source to the Gulf of Mexico. General Grant, displaying the magnanimity that would later define his presidency, had agreed to parole the Confederate garrison rather than transport them to northern prison camps. This decision reflected both practical considerations. The Union Army lacked sufficient resources to guard and feed nearly 30,000 prisoners, and a recognition of the extraordinary courage displayed by the defenders. Captain Whitmore oversaw the formal surrender of his company's battle flags, a ceremony that brought tears to the eyes of hardened veterans who had carried these colors through dozens of battles. The regimental standards, torn by shell fragments and stained with the blood of fallen comrades, represented far more than mere cloth. They embodied the hopes and sacrifices of men who had given everything for their cause. Boys, Whitmore addressed his skeletal troops, "We fought with honor and distinction. No man here has cause for shame. We held our ground against impossible odds and showed the world what Confederate soldiers can accomplish when duty calls." Private Murphy, now weighing barely 100 pounds compared to his robust 160 at the siege's beginning, helped stack the regiment's rifles in neat pyramids as required by the surrender terms. His hands shook with weakness, but his eyes remained clear and proud. The farm boy from Alabama had become a veteran in the truest sense, tested by the crucible of siege warfare and found worthy. The civilian population emerged from their underground refuges like ghosts rising from their graves. Emma Balfour, who had documented the siege's horrors in her diary, Road of the surrender day, we emerge into sunlight that seems foreign. After so many weeks in darkness, the city above ground is barely recognizable, a landscape of rubble and crater-marked earth. Yet we are alive, and for that miracle, we must be grateful. Sergeant Major Mackenzie, the gruff veteran who had held his men together through the darkest days of the siege, supervised the final formation of his company. Of the 120 men who had begun the siege, only 6 to 7 remained fit for duty. Disease, starvation, and enemy fire had claimed the rest, though the casualty rate was remarkably low considering the intensity and duration of the bombardment. The mining operations, which had continued even during surrender negotiations, were finally halted before the massive explosion could be detonated. Union engineers estimated that the 3,000 pounds of gunpowder beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan would have created a crater 60 feet across and 30 feet deep, large enough to obliterate an entire company of defenders. Contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly describe the surrender as the culmination of one of the most remarkable military campaigns in modern history, with both sides displaying exceptional courage and skill in the prosecution of their respective duties. The magazine noted that the siege had lasted longer than many complete wars, testing the endurance of combatants and civilians alike. General Pemberton faced the most difficult moment of his military career as he formally surrendered his sword to General Grant, the Union commander. In a gesture that would be remembered long after the war's end, immediately returned the weapon, acknowledging that the Confederate general had conducted the defense with honor and distinction. General Pemberton, Grant declared, "You and your men have nothing to be ashamed of. You have demonstrated that American soldiers, regardless of the cause they serve, are capable of extraordinary courage and dedication." History will remember the defense of Vicksburg as one of the finest examples of military valor in our nation's annals. As the Confederate battle flags were furled for the final time and the Union stars and stripes was raised over the courthouse, Harrison reflected on the campaign that had transformed him from a peacetime soldier into a veteran of one of the war's most significant battles. The siege of Vicksburg had cost both sides dearly. The Union had suffered over 10,000 casualties during the campaign, while Confederate losses were estimated at nearly 9,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The strategic consequences of Vicksburg's fall would be felt immediately throughout the Confederacy. With Union forces controlling the Mississippi River, Confederate states west of the river were effectively isolated from the seat of government in Richmond. Supplies and reinforcements could no longer flow freely between the eastern and western theaters of war, seriously hampering the South's ability to coordinate military operations. As the last Confederate soldiers marched out of Vicksburg under the terms of their parole, many turned for a final look at the city they had defended so courageously. The bluffs above the Mississippi River, once crowned with proud fortifications, now bore the scars of the longest siege in American history. Yet the memory of their sacrifice would endure long after the physical damage had been repaired. The siege of Vicksburg was over, but its lessons would influence military strategy for generations to come. The campaign had demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated land and naval operations, the importance of supply lines in modern warfare, and, above all, the incredible capacity of American soldiers to endure hardship and maintain their honor even in the face of certain defeat.